Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fawcett. Each week we interview experts in AI, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. In our show today, we look at AI-enabled voice of the customer. I'm joined by Kevin Yang, founder and co-CEO of Idiomatic. Kevin, welcome.
Glad to be here.
So could you start by just giving us a little introduction of yourself and then tell us a little bit about Idiomatic, what you guys are up to?
Yeah, absolutely. Personally, I'm a repeat entrepreneur and father of 3 little girls. But I became obsessed with voice of customer when I started my first business 14 years ago. It was an online lunch delivery business. And at the start, I was our first customer service rep and our first software engineer. And so, the product feedback loop was perfect. And I knew exactly what the problems our customers needed us to work on. The business grew quickly. We went from 0 to 50 million in revenue in 5 years. And all of a sudden, we were drowning in way too much feedback for any person to ingest. And we knew from our analytics that the ratings were perfectly correlated with growth and retention, all the good business metrics. But we didn't have a clear view of how do you actually improve those ratings.
Sure.
And so what I did, because everyone thinks that they love food more than average, is that I hired a ton of interns to read our reviews and email digests of what was happening every day to the whole company every day. But it was just a sea of anecdotes and everyone's just running around solving all one-off problems. And I realized, so we ended up working on a series of big initiatives that didn't really move the needle. And I realized what was happening was that they weren't actually the biggest problems that our customers were facing. And so about 8 years ago, I left my daily operation job role at that food delivery company and started Idiomatic to actually solve this problem. And so what Idiomatic does is we use AI to automate the process of building a successful voice of customer program. And we collect all the data sources in one place. We discover the set of issues that the customers are talking about. We automatically label, every piece of feedback with those issues. And then we automate reporting so that people within the organization can see the information that they need to see. And the goal is to give decision makers like my past self the data-backed insights that a specific action was actually going to move the needle for the customer, right? And so Slack was our very first customer. And over the years, we've worked with some great customer-focused brands like Disney and Pinterest and HubSpot. And the one thing that I'm sure we'll talk about is we started this 8 years ago. We've been an AI company long before the current Gen AI renaissance. So while we've incorporated the latest AI advances, we've really stayed laser focused on this business problem of making voice of customer efforts successful.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just to kind of help the audience out a bit before we jump into the tech, because I'm very interested in all the use cases you mentioned around the AI. But before we jump there, I mean, most people I think understand voice of the customer when you say it. But then if you start to think about it in the context of the business, why is it hard for companies to use the data, to aggregate the data, all those different things? So tell us a little bit of background around voice of the customer first to get started.
Yeah. So a great voice of customer program does basically 2 things. First, it helps the company realize what the big problems are, very much like the use case that I was describing in my previous company, right? What are the things that matter most to customers? And then the second thing it does is it helps the company answer tactical questions about how do you actually execute specific projects, right? So for example, if you know that login is a big pain point, right? Then what about login and what exactly do you have to fix in order to bring the incidence or the friction down? And so to solve the first problem, to understand what's causing the most pain, right, across all your customers, the typical way of doing this is to have someone, usually customer service agents or voice of customer analysts, hand label each of these pieces of feedback, right? And doing this manually for anyone is expensive, manual. The people doing it don't like doing it because it's kind of boring. And it also turns out to be pretty inaccurate because it's hard especially when volumes get large enough that you can't just have one person do it, it's very hard to have multiple people have consistent views of what is the definition of this issue versus that issue. And then you end up with like lots of inconsistency, right? And so, upon manual audits of these manual efforts, the error rates are frequently like 50%, right? And for decision makers, it's like, well, if the error rate's 50%, how am I actually going to make decisions based on this data, right? They're not really willing to. So that's the problem with like, okay, figuring out what the biggest pain points are. And then for the deep dives, like the typical way this happens, so that example I gave earlier, say, okay, 20% of the issues of the contacts are about problems with login. Well, okay, to do the deep dive, it's like, well, what about login, right? What are the specific sub-issues? Are they tied to certain product releases? Are they specific to certain devices or platforms, right? Like you need all this additional information. And the way this is traditionally done is you have someone go and do a deep dive. They pull a bunch of relevant information, say 1,000 examples where people have complained about login and all the metadata. They just kind of pour through it. And it's like a 2-week research project, right? And, I think typically you can get smart people to do this and the results will be pretty good. But it slows down the whole organization. And it makes it so that people making decisions are more likely to just not ask the questions and just like, look at a couple of anecdotes and decide. But that, in my experience, results in hugely wasted resources. Right.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And I think the idea too that, that, you have this piece of feedback, but you really need to know more than that. You need the context around it. You need to know some about the behaviors around it, because it's not always clearly leading you somewhere that you can make actionable. So that seems like that creates a lot of confusion. And then the other thing you said, and I've been on the other side of this doing all that tagging and trying to understand. So it is painful, but it's also not really very scalable. I mean, the bigger the business gets, the more customer feedback you have, the worse the problem gets because it's just so big, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned this before, and I want to dig in a little bit around this. So you started Idiomatic before Gen AI. So you were really working with what I like to call traditional AI, just to keep the camps separated a little bit. So what did you originally build into your application using traditional AI, and how did that help make that problem better before Gen AI?
Yeah. So as distinguishing between traditional and Gen AI has been around for a long time, right? And like, every time you do a Google search, right, AI is figuring out what are the results that are relevant to you.
Right.
And so for most of Idiomatic's existence, the way we use traditional AI was we were building classifiers to figure out, okay, you have a novel piece of feedback, right? Support ticket, a survey, a review. What issue should it go into, right? And the way we did that is we, to a little bit nerdy, we basically turn every piece of feedback into a vector, a mathematical representation of what the key concepts within that filter, within that piece of feedback. And then we compare that to the universe of labeled pieces of feedback we already have, right? And so if we see that mathematically like a piece of feedback looks similar to the previous examples that we have, then we can calculate what the probability it is that it belongs in that issue. And I think here the trick was like, how do you actually develop that mathematical representation? And we were actually using the same underlying model. It was called BERT that Google uses for their searches, right? And so, but that was the core thing we were doing. We were building really high quality classification models. Even then, it was outperforming human labels tremendously. The error rate's about a third of what human labels were achieving when audited by an expert.
Yeah, I mean that in itself would be a significant improvement for any company. So
Yeah,
that's
and it's also instantaneous and it's cheaper than having people do it, right?
yeah, and also you don't have to torture a bunch of interns to get them to to sit in a room and yeah, okay. So that makes a lot of sense, and I see, I see the progression here. So now let's add Gen AI to the mix
Yeah.
because it's available now, been out for a couple of years, right? And how are you using that today? And then what problems does it solve for customers? Like what kind of technologies and methodologies are you using underneath that to combine this with what you already had to improve the results?
Yeah. So over these 8 years we've been running this business, we have worked with a lot of customer experience professionals, and we kind of understand their workflow at a deep level, right?
Sure.
And so the way we thought about this is, how do you use Gen AI to actually streamline a lot of these things that the voice of customer or CX professionals would
Mhm.
do anyway?
Right.
So one of the most common things, right, is that deep dive that we talked about,
Yeah.
right? Uh, you have 20% of your issues are login. There's like 10,000 examples. What is in there?
Yeah.
And so we built a feature called Granularity Generator that basically goes through, reads all the tickets, pulls out every single sub issue within a group of tickets, and then associates each individual ticket with those sub issues, right? It's
Mm.
like basically goes one layer deeper at a click of a button, and it shaves off like a week of work right in a
Yeah.
minute. And of course then the professional with the business context can look at that and kind of
Mm.
refine it further, but like it's really a great head start without needing to like pull into an Excel spreadsheet and start tagging.
Right.
um, and in terms of what it's built on top of, it's built on top of the latest LLMs. Right now, we're using OpenAI's GPT-4o Mini, which is like a week or two old.
Yeah,
But
that's a fresh one.
it's actually trivial for us to switch models, right?
Yeah.
We actually do it all the time whenever companies release a faster, better, or cheaper model, and then we have a methodology in place to make sure that the results are good, right?
Mm.
Like I think when it comes to Gen AI features, you actually have to do the same thing you have to do for good software engineering development. You
Mm.
have to test, right? And so we have automated and manual testing regimens in place to make sure that the results are good.
Mm.
Um, but the Gen AI feature that I think is actually really unique to Idiomatic, right? And it's kind of part of our defining feature in this ecosystem, is that we've taught LLMs how to discover issues in a way that is that's tailored to every business,
Mm.
right? And so, like when we were working with all those companies we talked about before Gen AI, we had a data science team that would actually
Mm.
go through the data and basically curate a tailored hierarchy for every business, right?
Right.
Because obviously Disney is going to be very different from Pinterest, like it's
Yeah.
just and and it almost requires business expertise. But we were actually able to very successfully do it with data scientists.
Mm.
And we have basically taught the LLM step by step in terms of like what they were doing
Mm.
to kind of do this iterative thinking to kind of come up with good hierarchies that come directly from the feedback being provided. And that's kind of like the core. That's one of the most differentiating
Mm.
features that we've been able to build with this technology.
One of the things that I've seen in some other applications of generative AI, and I'm curious if this may also be a benefit for what you're doing, is that capability to just naturally have a conversation with the data versus having to build queries and everything is really structured. I mean, is that also something that has helped customers?
Yeah, well, so this is actually something that we've been building. So one of the things that we found is that it is actually somewhat difficult to just allow people to write a question and get that answered well, right? You
Yeah.
know, one of the big drawbacks of Gen AI is hallucinations. And like, if it doesn't really know the answer, I mean, all it's really doing is it's just predicting what the next word is. And it
Yep.
doesn't have like a very strong sense of like, is this right or not?
Yep.
So one feature that we are like in alpha on and will be releasing literally in the coming weeks is that we figured out that you can actually get AI to answer these questions almost completely accurately if instead of using the large language model, you have it turn it into code, into a query, and then it executes the code on the underlying data. Like it's actually, that actually works super well, right? And so, you know, I think we have been trying to refine our feature in a way that we can prompt a user to craft questions in a way that will be suitable for this type of work, right? And so in this case, it's more like, okay, rather than like just talking to a chatbot and just getting whatever answer, it's more like if you were to go to a data analyst, a business analyst that works at your business and say, hey, can you do this piece of analysis for me? Right now, we can just do that for them kind of on the fly.
Nice. So it's almost like you're providing that data science expertise using the model versus, you know, a traditional method of having a data scientist actually have to interact with the person and the data and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that makes
exactly.
sense. So the other thing I'm curious about, because you mentioned vector databases earlier, are you doing some sort of RAG with this too? Are you using a vector database for the customer data and then insulating that from the model, or how does that piece of it come together?
Can you clarify that
Yeah, I
question?
can. Sorry, that's a tough one. So I was just curious from a trust and safety, privacy sort of
Yeah.
perspective, but then also just in generally from a functional perspective, how are you isolating the customer
I
data
see.
from the model itself?
So when we work with a given client, their data, we promise them that their data is only used for their purposes, right? Now, back when we were building BERT classification models, one thing that we would do is we would take like a bunch of unlabeled data that the customer is giving us, and we would use that to refine the BERT model. It's called pre-training, and it actually like changes kind of the universe of language being used inside the transformer to better reflect the universe of language that their customers are using.
Yep.
And what ends up happening is that the vector representations become a lot more rich, right? Because you know, the pieces of feedback that Pinterest is getting is only a tiny fraction of potential English or, you know, all language language that could happen. And if you can narrow the universe to really focus on the types of concepts that people would be talking about with Pinterest, you'll get better results. And so like we do that type of pre-training, but what we promise all of our customers is that we will never use their data to train a model or for any purpose that is beyond their specific use case, right?
Yeah.
And so that's and I think that's worked perfectly well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, all they care about is the idea that it's isolated and that you're protecting that information. So that makes a lot of sense to me. So shift gears a little bit. Let's go back to talking about the AI-driven voice of the customer now. So how are companies using that to improve their customer experience, manage their customer experience, and then maybe you could share a success story or two that gives us, you know, an illustration of how that's worked for your customers.
Yeah, absolutely. So clients that use the AI-driven voice of customer are able to answer questions in basically instantaneously instead of with a 2-week lag, right? Like that's the difference. And that results in faster and better decision making because they're tackling projects that they know customers care about. So one example, you know, I don't think this is proprietary since this is like a little bit old, is that our first customer, Slack, they released years ago this feature called threads, messaging threads. And with Idiomatic, they were able to identify, quantify, and prioritize all the support contacts coming in about this new feature in real time. and they prioritized it, and they did like this massive sprint over the next 2 weeks, and they fixed all the issues that were resulting in 80% of the contacts about this new feature within their first 2 weeks, right? And that is something that would have been very difficult to do if to answer every question you need 2-week deep dive. And today, like Threads is a fundamental part of the Slack experience, right? Like it's kind of hard to imagine it without. But there are like all these like idiosyncratic problems on first release, right?
Yeah, as a Slack user, I can tell you I do remember that release, and it was a little bit unpleasant at first. How about?
Yeah. But one thing I give them a lot of credit for, because we also worked with some of their competitors, is that the rate at which they were fixing problems, and this is baked into their DNA, but like the rate at which they were fixing problems was extraordinarily fast. And from a team design perspective, their support professionals were also their like product operations specialists, right? So they would spend half the day with customers and half the day with the product team. And I think that really helped with the speed at which they were able to act. And then another example is Upwork is like I think the world's largest freelancer platform, right? And there was a period of time where nearly half of their support cases were about payments after a job was done, right? Some sort of friction with like actually getting the freelancer paid or getting payment from the customer. And that's a huge amount of friction for their customers, right? This is their livelihood. So it's a huge amount of friction. And it was really expensive for their support team.
Yeah.
And so like, again, they were able to see, okay, what are all the granular issues underneath payments, right? And some of them are intractable, but some of them are actually high volume and easy to solve. And so the product team just picked 5 of those, hammered them out. Contact rate related to payments dropped by 40% in the first 6 months. And that, it has translated into like millions and millions of dollars of savings, not to mention just a much better experience for people making their livelihoods and getting their work done, right, on Upwork.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, those are really good examples. I feel like most people are familiar with both of those products. So, or at least Slack, because I mean, it's used all over the place these days. And that is something that I feel like those companies, especially product-led growth type companies, have really invested a lot in quickly resolving those issues, because that friction is in fact, that reduction in the friction is a part of their business model. So that makes sense. So, we sort of hit on this already, but a little bit about the analysis of the data, but more so, how is this used with other systems in their business? Like, are you integrating into their other environment there so that they can manage that data and use it in different ways?
Yeah, so we typically connect directly to all the systems where the data is being gathered, right? So the most common systems are help desks, survey platforms, review platforms, social media, and all these systems, like all the modern systems, have APIs. So, and the reason that we've invested in making it so we can ingest all of this programmatically is because typically the CX or VoC organizations don't have dedicated engineering resources.
Right.
And so if you're telling them that, hey, to use some solution, you have to like bridge this gap, like they're just like, it's kind of a non-starter.
Right.
And so, so that we have kind of like plug and play integrations with all of them. And in addition to just ingesting the customer feedback, we also ingest relevant metadata, right? So for, let's say, a subscription business, they're able to see feedback. We're able to pull in, hey, are they on a free trial? Are they on a specific plan? Are they in a specific market? And so, the relevant stakeholder within the business, if you're in the product team that's focused on like trial conversion, it's very important that you're only looking at customers in a certain part of the life cycle, right? And so we pull all that metadata in as well, and then we automate the reporting, right? So the way we try to think about it is that a relatively small VoC team, working with Idiomatic, can basically offer their organization as if they have an embedded VoC analyst in every single team, right? Because now it just takes some work to like configure, okay, here are the issues that are probably relevant to this growth team, or here are the issues that are relevant to that team. And then and then people will be able to just get that reporting on an ongoing basis with no additional work.
Yeah, so it's really making it systematic inside the business, right? The whole process and all of it then ends up being, a standard workflow that they get used to using and incorporating in their daily work.
Yeah.
That Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously the data ingestion piece is probably the most complex part of the integration pieces because there's so many different data sources that you could be using depending on the company, right?
Yeah, and every one of these systems stores the data in slightly different ways, right?
Yep.
So like the popular help desks, whether it's Zendesk or Salesforce, like are
Mhm.
architected in very different ways,
Yeah.
and so, but the nice thing is that it's standard for all of their customers. So for
Mhm.
Zendesk, 100,000 customers, they will basically get all of this
Right.
robust integration out of the box, right?
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. And even like the product analytics tools and a lot of rich data that comes from a lot of different tools and tool sets that we're using now in the business that are very different. And then like we talked about product like growth businesses. I mean, those are businesses that have to eliminate friction or the business model doesn't work.
Right,
So
exactly.
yeah, so it's business critical from that perspective. Yeah.
Right.
So when they're starting to use these tools, what kind of challenges do they have around the implementation? And then how are you helping them address the use of and building that into a systematic kind of approach?
Yeah. You know, we've actually touched on a couple of the main things. Like
Mm,
data integration is a huge
mm,
problem. You actually see a lot of like voice of customer teams using just a tiny fraction of the data, like
mhm.
because they'll like only use survey data because that's what they have access to, and support is a different part of the organization and they don't have access to it,
Right.
and they're just leaving that when actually our view, and maybe I'm biased because I used to do support and be the engineer,
Mm,
is that like support data is gold because it is the moment in time where customers are trying to buy, use, or troubleshoot your product, right?
right.
And so like the value of the feedback provided there is so much greater than asking people to give you an MPS review like 3 weeks
Right.
later, right?
Right.
And so I think breaking down these data silos is one of the big things that we do for companies. And another challenge with adopting AI solutions is, and we talked a little bit earlier about hallucination, right?
Mm,
And that is the problem with Gen AI, especially with the core goal of voice of customer being having conviction that the insights that you get are correct, so you can act
right.
on them, make big business bets. If they're wrong, then it kind of defeats the whole point, right?
Yep.
And so I think the bar for accuracy is extraordinarily high. And so, yeah, one thing that we have done a lot of is understanding what LLMs are good and bad at, and
Mm,
really designing our features to only use the things that they're good at,
yeah.
and either straight up block the LLMs from doing the things that we know that they're bad at, or like guide the customer in a certain way so that they don't go down that road.
Mm,
So that's yeah, I mean that's kind of like the reason why, while ostensibly you could just like open up ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or Claude and like paste in data and ask it
right.
questions, I guarantee you if you double check it, it's like not right, right?
Yeah.
And so we do a lot of work to mitigate that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because you're not getting the same level of context in the data if you just cut and paste something into the model itself directly versus you have built a whole system around making sure that the context is available and
Right.
understood as a part of that answer. So that makes sense to me that you're, dramatically improving the output of the language model because of the fact that the wealth of data you have about that interaction, whatever it might
Mhm.
be. Yeah. So we touched a little bit on privacy, ethical use already. So it's probably, I mean, unless there's something else you think that would be useful to add, I won't go down that path much further. But I do think it's customers do really care about this part, and I'm sure you've seen that too. So
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I would add there is, so earlier we talked about like keeping the data siloed.
mhm.
The other thing is we don't pull data that we don't need, right? Actually, we
Mm,
like, especially when we work with financial institutions or healthcare institutions that have very high privacy
Right.
bars.
Right.
Our general approach is, A, don't pull the structured data. Don't pull email or names
Mm.
when from the various systems we integrate with. But second, we actually also redact before we store anything. We redact all of the information, right? So there are AI models that can go and redact all of this.
Right.
And so obviously we also have all the standard security and confidentiality technical things in place. But let's just reduce the surface area, right, of potential problems, because at least for what we're doing, knowing who the customer is not that important.
No.
Right.
No.
And so we just try to get rid of all of it, particularly for customers with sensitivity here.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to approach that way. I mean, when I was at G2, obviously we were taking a lot of that voice of the customer kind of information in, and that was a part of our whole privacy compliance process, was in fact to strip the PII out of it before it was used anywhere that with a customer or using it for research or whatever, right? So yeah, so that to me, that seems like the most logical way. And I would assume also from a GDPR standpoint, in Europe, you're compliant if that is the case, if you're stripping that out. Yeah. So obviously you work with a lot of businesses, a lot of different kinds of businesses with this. So what would you, from an advice standpoint, how would you advise customers to think about this? How can they integrate AI into their customer feedback process? And then, you know, when should they get moving with this? Like, is it business critical? Should it be something that they can move now because the technology's evolved to that point? Or
I do think that the technology is good enough. However, I think the two pieces of advice I would give folks is, one, first, be very clear as to what problem they're trying to solve. And only work with companies and seek out companies that solve exactly that problem. And you have to look beyond the marketing speech, because like in our space, right, in the customer insight space, like everyone from a survey company like a Qualtrics or Medallia to like a call center automation software company will claim to be able to turn feedback into actionable insights. Like you can literally find that term in all of their websites. But like depending on what you're trying to do, like the vast majority of companies that make that claim are not actually applicable to your situation, right? So I think the starting point there is to be like do the homework and say, okay, what am I trying to solve? And then the second thing is that because there's so much hype here, insist on doing a proof of concept to actually see what is possible before you sign anything or commit to anything, right? We work with AI every day. Like I run our product engineering team, so I'm always so impressed by what it can do. But we also spend an incredible amount of resources. We spent millions and millions of dollars of R&D dealing with its shortcomings. And so there's going to be wildly different outcomes for different vendors, depending on how sophisticated they are from a technology perspective. And the only way you can really see it is like insist on them showing you, right? So like for us, you could go to our website, idiomatic.com, and just start a free trial and connect data, and you'll see. And like this either meets your needs or it doesn't. But like I think that is kind of a way of avoiding getting trapped by vaporware, right?
Well, and I mean, one of the things that kind of a theme through this whole conversation is that you're connecting to all of these disparate data sources. So you aggregate all that feedback and then try to make sense of it, versus I'm looking at, full story data from the website or from a product page or whatever, or I'm looking at, talk desk, help desk, Salesforce, whatever it is, just from that interaction. But the problem is each of those in their own little silo don't necessarily tell the whole story. But if you can put the whole story together around that issue, you have a much better narrative when you're trying to go back to the product and figure out what it is to fix. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that resonates from my perspective, because again, I've seen so many companies go down the single data source path and instead pulling this all together and then having the capability to build a repeatable process. And that, frankly, at G2, that was one of the things when customers ask us how they should think about it. That was one of the biggest things for me, was helping them understand they need a systematic way to approach this problem and deal with whatever the outputs are in a way that, does get to the problem and then gets to the solution to the problem.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we're getting short on time, but one of the things I like to get before with every guest before we drop off is could you recommend someone, a thought leader, an author, book that you think the audience would enjoy and would be, useful for them to know?
Yeah. So this isn't about AI, but for people that like storytelling and like business building, I'd recommend the Startup Podcast by Gimlet Media.
Mm,
And so season one here is basically a documentary series by Alex Bloomberg, who was an NPR radio journalist. I think he
yep.
worked on This American Life and Plant Money. And he talks about very candidly his experience of starting this podcasting company
Hmm.
and the ups and downs. And I think it was like great storytelling, but it was also kind of cathartic to me as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just fun. It's about 10 years old now, so a little bit dated.
Yep.
But I was like, I can't believe this exists when I heard it.
Well, and to be honest, I do know this one because when I was launching this podcast, I had actually used that as a resource to help to
Okay.
learn about how to do this and some of the problems to overcome. So that's a fantastic recommendation.
Yeah.
What I've actually taken personally myself already. So
Yeah.
thank you. That's great. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for joining the show today. Really, really good conversation. And I know the audience is really going to find this valuable. So thank you.
Yeah. No, it was a pleasure.
And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining. Remember to hit that subscribe button. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform to help others find the show. For more on AI and other software research reports, briefs, and blog posts, check out arionresearch.com. If you have AI, generative AI, or business automation expertise, either as a provider or as an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arionresearch.com, and we'll see if we can get you on as a guest. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arion Research production. I'm Michael Fawcett, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.